So what is Project 2025? Let me give you a compare and contrast. In January 2021, in his denial of the 2020 election and in his encouragement of those who marched on the Capitol to stop the legal transfer of power, Donald Trump carried out an attempted coup. Project 2025 is the attempt almost 4 years later to carry out a legal coup by taking over America's agencies and making them bend to the will of an executive led by Donald Trump, which could actually verge at times on autocracy. So in 2022, there was an intersection between the Heritage Foundation, which has been a longstanding conservative think tank from the 1970s, and former Trump officials. The Heritage Foundation back in 1980, for the Ronald Reagan administration, something called Mandate for Change. And this was like their blueprint for how Reagan should run the administration. And they've used that as the basis to periodically put these out with the idea of what a new Republican administration would look like. And indeed, the current Project 2025 document refers back to the 1980 document. Says, look, we did this for Reagan. We're just doing this, for a Trump administration. What it elides is that the Heritage Foundation of today is very different from the Heritage Foundation of back then. I mean, the Heritage Foundation back in the 1980s was very much what you might think of as the conservatives, which were Reagan conservatives. They very much wanted to cut back the size of government. They wanted to decrease taxes, fiscal conservatism and so on. But they also were very committed to a type of international security, which was based on the post-1945 international order. Although they were socially conservative, they didn't want to be aggressive. For example, at the end of the day, they didn't go out and try to bring prayer into schools. They did not try to overturn Roe v. Wade using legislation. So abortion rights were maintained. The Heritage Foundation now, in part because it interacts with other parts of this hard right network, especially those funded by a guy named Leonard Leo, who's tried to remake the American judiciary through something called the Federalist Society, right? A project to pack it with, arch conservative judges. Because Heritage Foundation is part of sort of like that more activist network rather than being a think tank. Very, very different. And then you bring the Trump folks in. And the Trump folks, a lot of whom are upset that they got turfed out in 2021, some of whom are very, very close to Trump himself and his views that the election was stolen from him. One of the contributors to this project is Peter Navarro, a guy who has just served a 6-month contempt of Congress charge because he wouldn't testify over the Capitol riots. People like that, they come in, and so you get this interaction from the middle of 22 until the document comes out. And this is like a 900-page document, right? So in the guise of being like an approach to the American bureaucracy, this is a Trumpist mission. And Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation, said this. He said, this is institutionalizing Trumpism. His words, not mine. And that means that in the guise of restoring the executive, what they're trying to do is demolish checks and balances in the U.S. government. They're trying to demolish checks and balances between the executive and the judiciary because you pack the judiciary with arch conservatives. You destroy the balance with Congress because you expand the executive powers in a particular way. And you destroy the balance within the executive because you politicize every agency. Something which in the UK is forbidden, absolutely forbidden to politicize. There are rules why you don't politicize the civil service. That's precisely what Project 2025 is. So how much power does Donald Trump get? And have any Republicans really thought this through? Let me answer the first part in terms of I think one of the biggest things where Trump expands his power is not just by being able to issue executive orders. And by the way, there's a hint in the document, gives it a rationale. The first executive order that Trump issued in 2017, you might remember, was the disastrous Muslim ban, which fell apart within 72 hours because it wasn't organized. The document provides a rationale to bring in another Muslim ban. It's not quite phrased that way, but that's the type of thing he could do just like that, right? But the big power he gets is they expand the ability to put political appointees into agencies. So you push aside the career officials. They are now secondary to the political officials, and not just like the secretaries or the deputy secretaries, all the way through the agencies. And that is exactly what Trump tried to do in the last months in 2020. Um, when he was trying to hang on to office, you might remember. I mean, he replaced he replaced this Secretary of Defense Secretary. William Barr left at Justice Department, and he tried to pack it with people that would back the election fraud, falsehood. So this time, you do it from the start. You run the political appointees in. Now, have the Republicans thought through this? No, absolutely not. Because right now, the Republican Party is not a Republican Party; it's a Trumpist party. Um, it's it's not the case that every legislator is a Trumpist. Far from it. In fact, most of the senators are not. But most legislators have had to bend the knee to Trump, to curry his favor. And at this point, let us be honest here. If you face the possibility that Donald Trump got into office in 2025, and then you say, well, a Democrat might win in 2028, and we'll come into 2029, and now the Democrat has all this power. You set up the system where you don't necessarily have to hand the power over. Now, this isn't hyperbolic. You put all the political appointees in, they declare the election to be invalid. So, which is the Trumpist playbook. And right now, the Republicans are in, though, even those Republicans who are opposed to Trump are in a scramble as to what you do. Because remember, for example, uh, the Senate Majority Leader, Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who stood against Trump at times, he's retiring. He's going. So there's a possibility the Trumpists will finally get the Senate leader, just as they currently have the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who by and large was installed by the Trumpist, although he's detached himself a bit. It's not that he's a straight out Trumpist, but yeah, he owes his position to the Trumpist rebelling against the previous Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. I don't think when Project 2025 eventually comes out with hundreds of pages, I may be wrong. I don't think Donald Trump's ever read it, right? I don't think Donald Trump, I know he didn't contribute anything to it, right? So it's not like Trump knows everything that Project 2025 is doing. But the point here is you're not just talking about if Trump gets into the White House, you're talking about a Trump administration. And a lot of the people who contributed to Project 2025 were members of the past administration and probably would be members of the next one. So, for example, Christopher Miller, who was acting Secretary of Defense, has written the chapter on Department of Defense. Ken Cuccinelli, who was high up in the Department of Homeland Security, has written the chapter on Homeland Security. One of the two people who were the editors of the project, a guy named Paul Dance, he was the chief of staff for the Office of Personnel Management, which of course is part of this idea of politicizing the bureaucracy. So you've got that lay that the contributors are very much part of what would be a Trump administration. And then you've got what Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, says. Now, he didn't serve in the Trump administration. He's an interesting story. He came from Wyoming Catholic College. Then he headed up a Texas project, which became notorious, for example, pulling books from shelves in schools because they were too left. But Roberts has effectively said this is a mission to go after the administrative state. In other words, you break up what Trump calls the deep state. Now, there's an episode to get specific to this. Because the Democrats, uh, when Joe Biden was in a lot of trouble, okay, the Democrats said, look, we got to change the narrative here. We've got to focus on the threat of Project 2025. And they started to highlight it probably about a month ago. And at that point, some of Trump's advisors told Trump, said, oh, you've got to disown this. And Trump went out and said, oh, this is terrible. This is a radical project. I have nothing to do with it. Kevin Roberts was asked about it. Kevin Roberts says, we take no offense at this. We know he's doing this as part of political tactics, right? So the key thing I think to understand here is, all right, where's the intersection between Trump as a person and Project 2025? So let me go back to that whole idea. Before we talk about specific policies, for example, like banning abortion in all cases, before we talk about banning anything which has to deal with gender equality, right? Banning any reference to climate change. Before we talk about policies, the mission of Project 2025 is to break up or to co-opt the bureaucracy to serve your will. Donald Trump's personal mission is to break what he calls the deep state. He's always said that because Trump wants agencies to serve whatever he wants to do. And we can talk about incidents where he has fired heads of agencies. In one case, firing the head of the FBI, James Comey, and bragging to the Russian foreign minister about it. Uh, you know, but at the end of his administration, of course, Trump blames the deep state for not keeping him in office in what was the attempted coup. He blames the Justice Department for not calling the election fraudulent. He blames the State Department for being riddled with people, career diplomats who would not implement his crazed foreign policy. And he blames, for example, of course, the Environmental Protection Agency. That's got to go because it promotes climate change. Or sorry, it doesn't. It thinks climate change is a threat. So Trump thinks agencies should bend to his will. Heritage gives him the blueprint, the intellectual rationale to go in and purge the agencies. Yeah. I think the first thing to do is to talk about the rhetoric here. The rhetoric's really important in terms of the rationale for which they're going to implement the policies. Uh, from the start of Kevin Roberts' introduction to this through each of the chapters, it's riddled with attack phrases, right? So, for example, um, the U.S. Government, the agencies have now been riddled by progressive elites. They have been taken over by those who are promoting woke policies. They are suffering from the infiltration and the spread of cultural Marxism. Now, all of these phrases, if you talk about a day-to-day running of a bureaucracy, it's ridiculous. I know a lot of American bureaucrats, and there's a range of them. They do have views which generally range from center right to center left, but I haven't met one cultural Marxist who was a U.S. government employee. That's just me, right? But that, of course, is the pretext that's going out there. And so when you get the chapters, for example, that is written by Christopher Miller, who is the former acting Secretary of Defense, he's talking about the need to, that the Army and the Navy have become platforms for social engineering rather than defending the country. And what he's kicking against, let's be honest here, is, for example, the policies by which LGBT members can be parts of the military. You can be gay and serve in the armed forces. And that's what he's attacking. Let's be upfront about what he's talking about. So they use this guise of social engineering to attack the State Department, that the State Department is doing things like doing woke policies. What does woke policies mean? It means, for example, promoting human rights, including women's rights, right? So that's the rationale. Now, what does it mean when they get in? Well, I'll give you the second level, which is an example of where we're going to head with this, and that is we know that Trump already banned references to climate change in terms of environmental documents and scientific documents. We know that. Roberts goes further. The president of the Heritage Foundation, as the overlay for that, says we have to ban all references to sexual orientation and gender identity. We have to ban all references to gender equality in government. We have to ban all references to reproductive rights. What does that do? What that rationale is, for example, you ban the references to reproductive rights, and that opens up the door for going for a full ban on abortion. Now, I don't know if a Trump administration would even pursue a full ban on abortion. I can talk about why they may not go for a federal ban on abortion. They may just kick it over to the states, but it is quite clear that in the introduction of this document, Roberts is saying we're going to go for a federal ban on abortion because one of the other buzz phrases they put in there is the government must protect the family. And you use that for going after reproductive rights and also going after LGBTQ, right? So I think you're going to see the attempt to strip away environmental regulations. That is quite clear. You are going to strip away any attempt to promote diversity because Roberts also says diversity should not be referred to in any government document. You're going to see an attempt to roll back LGBTQ rights. That's very clear about that. You're going to see, in terms of foreign policy, China, China, China. The only country that is discussed in detail in the foreign policy section is China. And that is, they want to front up to China militarily, economically, and socially. What that means elsewhere is a pivot away from Europe. So, not that the US withdraws from NATO, but that it reduces its expenditure and its contribution in NATO in terms of not only money, but also personnel and also logistics, right? So the US pulls out of NATO. It means cutting off a lot of aid to Ukraine, not necessarily all military aid, but cutting off all American economic aid to Ukraine. That goes, Europe should have to do that. It means even longtime American allies like South Korea cannot be assured of US aid in the future because the document says South Korea should stand up against North Korea. They should be able to do that economically. So it's not quite an isolationist policy, but it's a policy where you focus on one enemy, you put all your effort there, and then you just let others take on. The U.S. will pull out of international organizations, or it will limit its contribution to international organizations. The document trashes the World Health Organization again and again, and we know the reason for that because the World Health Organization called out Trump's quackery over COVID. So that's got to go. Where else can we go in terms of Department of Justice? You got the Department of Justice. You absolutely got it in terms of its authority, because Department of Justice, of course, would not support Trump over the attempt to overturn 2020 election, and of course, the Department of Justice carried out the Mueller investigation with a special prosecutor, right? So Trump said, to give you the intersection of all of this, on day one, I get into the White House, I'm going to seek retribution against my enemies. The Heritage Foundation identifies enemies both in terms of the bureaucrats it doesn't like and the policies it doesn't like. And that's what you're talking about. You're not talking about restoring American bureaucracy. You're talking about fighting a civil war on behalf of Donald Trump against the US system. I think if it was the only uh, arrow in the Democrats' quiver going into this election, I think there's a risk that people would get jaded of it really quick and get a little bit and get confused by it. Fact of the matter is that, with old Joe sucking up all the narrative, the Democrats were like, well, what are we going to do here? The election reset this past Sunday. I mean, completely reset. And when you talk about Harris versus Trump, which is starts off from like almost a dead heat in the polling. So you go back to square one. Harris has got a lot more arrows in the quiver, and you've already seen some of them deployed. She's going to go out for women's rights, especially reproductive rights. She's going to go out for responsibility and competence in government. She's going to play up issues like being responsible about climate change. Uh, and then she's going to go about threat to democracy, where she may invoke Project 2025, but she's also going to play up the idea that she's the prosecutor versus the convicted felon, which she already did to great effect in a speech in Wisconsin on Tuesday. So I don't think the Democrats are going to lose the advantage on Project 2025 simply because I don't think it's going to be their main line against the Republicans right now. Um, right now, I'll tell you, it's a toss-up election, but I would have told you as of this past Sunday that it was a gone elect. It was gone. That Biden versus Trump, there's no way they hand Trump the keys to the White House. Now that changed, there is an energy amongst the Democrats. There's fundraising amongst the Democrats. They don't have to go negative with Project 2025 so much. They can also go positive in terms of what they're going to do to make sure that the American system continues to serve Americans.